The first thing Ren noticed about the human was how wrong he looked. He came through the airlock of the gentle dawn with a small bag over one shoulder and a face that seemed stuck in some kind of expression she had never seen before on any species that mattered. His lips were pulled back slightly to show flat white teeth that could not tear anything, and his eyes were round and wet like a newborn pup who had not yet learned to fear the dark. He was soft. Everything about him was soft. His skin had no fur and no armor and no scales. It was just pale and bare and thin enough that she could see the blue rivers of blood running beneath it. Ren sat on the upper platform of the creche hall with her pack siblings watching the new caretaker arrive. Keller was already growling low in his throat. Tavash had his ears pinned flat, which meant he was nervous. Solek, the smallest of them all, said nothing and simply watched with his big golden eyes from behind the others where he always hid. The human called himself Jonah Maren. He spoke their language with a strange accent that made every word sound like he was chewing something soft. He smiled when he introduced himself, and Ren saw 200 cubs stare at those flat, useless teeth and immediately decide that this creature was nothing. Among the Veyari, a caretaker was a title of weight. Caretakers were retired warriors. They were the ones who had fought in the wars and carried the scars to prove it. They walked into a room and the air itself seemed to move aside for them. Old Varak, who had been their caretaker before, had been missing half his left ear and 3 claws on his front paw, and when he spoke, even the boldest cubs went silent. Jonah was not old Varak. Jonah was a head shorter than most adult Veyari. He had no claws at all, just blunt little nubs at the end of soft fingers. He moved slowly, almost carefully, as if the ship itself might break under him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and warm like a fire that had been burning too long and forgotten how to roar. Keller said what everyone was thinking. He leaned over to Ren and whispered that this was an insult, that the interspecies cooperative had sent them a prey animal to guard their young. Ren did not answer because she was watching something the others had not noticed. When Jonah stepped through the airlock, he had paused, just for a breath. His round, soft eyes had moved across the room, and they had not moved the way prey eyes move. Prey looks for danger. Prey flinches. Prey searches for a way out. Jonah had looked at the ceiling first, then the corners, then every exit, then the placement of every cub in the room. It had taken him less than 2 seconds, and then the smile came back as if it had never left. Ren filed this away in a part of her mind. She did not yet have a name, for her first days were unremarkable. Jonah moved into the caretaker quarters near the main dormitory. He learned the names of every cub within 3 days, which was faster than old Varak had managed in a full season cycle. He was patient, and he was gentle, and he was always smiling, and because of all this, the cubs treated him like furniture. Something that existed in the room but did not matter. Keller tested him constantly. He would block doorways when Jonah approached. He would growl at him during meals. Once he swiped a paw near Jonah's face, fast enough to feel the air move. Jonah did not flinch. He simply waited for Keller to move and then continued walking as if nothing had happened. This made Keller angrier than if the human had fought back. The only cub who did not ignore Jonah was Solek. Solek was the runt. His fur was patchy and thin, and his legs were shorter than they should have been, and the other cubs reminded him of this constantly. He ate alone. He slept at the edge of the pile where it was coldest. He had learned to make himself so small that eyes passed over him. Like water over a stone, Jonah found him anywhere, and watched from across the dining. All as Jonah sat down next to Solek without asking and without making it into something big. He just sat and ate his strange human food and existed in the same space as the smallest cub on the ship. Solek looked up at him with those big golden eyes full of confusion because nobody sat next to Solek. Jonah said something to him. Ren was too far away to hear, but she saw Solek do something she had never seen him do before he stopped trying to disappear that night. As the cubs settled into the sleeping pile and the lights dimmed to the color of deep space, Ren lay awake and thought about the human, about prey eyes that mapped rooms like a hunter, about a voice so soft it should have been weak but somehow was not, about a creature with no fangs and no claws who had looked at the smallest, most forgotten cub on the ship and chosen to sit beside him. She did not understand Jonah Maren yet, but somewhere beneath her ribs, in the place where instinct lived before language, a small quiet warning had begun to hum. Something about the soft one was not soft at all. 3 weeks into the voyage, and the cubs had decided that Jonah was harmless. This was their first mistake. He taught differently from any Veyari instructor they had ever known. Where their old lessons had been about strength and speed, and the honor of charging into battle with your pack at your back, Jonah taught them something else entirely. He taught them how to think when thinking was the last thing your body wanted to do. He would sit them in a circle and give them a problem. Not a hunting problem, not a fighting problem, a surviving problem. You are alone, he would say. You are smaller than the thing that is coming for you. You cannot outrun it. You cannot overpower it. Your pack is not here. What do you do? The cubs gave their answers with the confidence of children who had never been truly afraid. Keller said he would fight anyway, because dying with honor was better than living as a coward. Tavash said he would call for the pack because the pack always comes. A younger cub named Brel said she would bare her throat and hope for mercy. Jonah listened to all of them with that patient warmth that never seemed to run dry. Then he shook his head. You change the ground, he said. You make the place where you stand into something that fights for you. You use what is there. You become the trap instead of the prey. Keller called it coward thinking. He said it loud enough for the whole circle to hear, and several cubs laughed. Jonah did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply nodded and said, maybe, and moved on. But Ren noticed that he did not change the lesson the next day or the day after that. He kept teaching the same thing in different ways, as if he were planting seeds in soil that was not ready yet and was willing to wait for rain. Weeks passed, and Jonah became a quiet constant in the rhythm of the ship. He was always awake before the cubs, and always the last to sleep. He checked the dormitory locks every night. He counted heads during every meal, and Ren realized he was doing it without looking like he was doing it. His eyes would sweep the room soft and casual, and somewhere behind that gentle gaze, a number was being kept. One evening, Ren found him alone in the observation lounge. The great curved window showed nothing but the black of deep space, dotted with the cold light of stars that were too far away to warm anything. Jonah was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his eyes on the void, and he looked for the first time like something that was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. She sat down near him, not next to him. Veyari cubs did not sit next to creatures. They were still measuring. But near enough. She asked him why he had taken this job. A caretaker on a creche ship was not a posting that humans fought for. It was not glamorous. It was not exciting. It was 200 cubs and recycled air and months between stars. Jonah was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is not empty, but full of something too heavy to lift. Easily, because where I come from, he said, the ones who protect. Children are the ones who remember what it felt like to be a child that nobody protected. Ren did not fully understand this, but something in the way he said it made the fur along her spine lie flat, the way it did when a storm was coming and the air changed before the first sound of thunder. Meanwhile, Solek was becoming a different cub. Not louder, not bigger, but steadier. Jonah had taught him a breathing trick, something humans used to calm their bodies when fear tried to take control. 4 counts in. Hold for 4. 4 counts out. Solek practiced it every night before sleep, and Ren could see the change. He still sat at the edge of things. He still flinched when Keller passed too close. But his eyes were different. They were not looking for escape anymore. They were looking at the room the way Jonah looked at a room. Small things fit into places. Big things cannot reach, Jonah had told him. Small things get overlooked. That is a kind of power. Something else was happening on the ship that the Cubs were not supposed to know about. The crew had grown tense. Warriors who normally walked the halls with loose, easy strides were now moving in pairs with weapons charged. Ren heard fragments of conversation between the adults. Signal echoes. Unidentified contacts at the edge of sensor range. Commander Shale had doubled the patrols. The Cubs did not know this. But Jonah did. Ren knew, because she watched him and she saw the night he moved his bedroll from his quarters into the Cub dormitory. Nobody asked him to do this. Nobody told him to. He simply appeared one evening with his thin blanket and his small bag and set himself up on the floor between the door and the sleeping pile of 200 children. Keller saw his chance. He had been waiting for weeks to prove what the human was, and now he stood over Jonah and demanded a sparring match. A simple test of strength. Nothing that would draw blood. Just enough to show the Cubs what Ren already suspected they had gotten wrong. Jonah looked up at him from the floor and said, "No thank you." Keller called him a prey animal. He said it with his fangs showing and his hackles raised and his claws clicking on the deck plates. Jonah stood up slowly. He was shorter than Keller by a full head. He had no claws, no fangs, no silver fur bristling with challenge. He looked up at the young Veyari with those round, soft human eyes, and, for one single breath, those eyes changed. The softness did not leave. But something moved behind it. Something that looked out through Jonah's face, the way a creature looks out from deep water. It was still, and it was calm, and it was so completely without fear that Keller's body understood it before his mind did. His hackles dropped. He stepped back. One step, involuntary, the ancient part of his brain that had kept his ancestors alive for 1,000,000 years had looked into those flat, round eyes and said, "Do not." The moment passed. Jonah smiled. The warmth came back. He picked up his blanket and walked away as if nothing had happened. Keeler did not challenge him again, and Ren lay in the sleeping pile that night. With her heart beating in a rhythm she did not recognize, and she thought about the things she had seen behind the soft eyes of the human. It was not anger. It was not hate. It was not the hot, bright fire of a predator. It was something patient and something old and something that had already decided a long time ago exactly what it was willing to do. The Creven came out of the dark like something the void itself had spit up. 3 fast attack corvettes, dropping out of subspace in a formation that left no room for misunderstanding. They were not here to negotiate. They were not here to plunder cargo. The Creven were insectoid slavers with black chitin shells and clicking mandibles and compound eyes that saw the galaxy as nothing more than a market. And in that market, the most valuable cargo was always the same children. Commander Shale. At 9 seconds between the sensor alarm and the first volley hitting the hull, she used 7 of them to swear in Old Veyari, and the remaining 2 to seal the bridge and activate what little defensive weaponry the Gentle Dawn carried. This was a creche ship. It was built for comfort and safety on the inside. It was not built to fight. The ship shuddered as the first plasma bolts connected. The lights went out for 3 terrible seconds, and when they came back, they were red. Emergency red. The color of blood and warning and the end of every safe thing. In the creche dormitory, 200 Cubs screamed. Ren had been sleeping when the first impact threw her from the pile. She hit the deck hard enough to taste copper in her mouth, and for a moment, the world was nothing but noise. Alarms howling. Cubs crying. The deep structural groan of a ship being hit again and again by something that wanted to crack it open like an egg. Then she heard his voice. It was not loud. That was the impossible thing. In a room full of screaming children and blaring alarms and the shuddering death sounds of a ship under fire, Jonah's voice should have been lost. But it cut through all of it. Not because of volume, because of certainty. Everyone look at me. Right now, 200 heads turned. 200 pairs of golden Veyari eyes found the human standing in the center of the dormitory, and something in them went still. Because the creature standing, there was not the same creature they had spent weeks dismissing as soft and harmless and made of nothing. Jonah was awake in a way they had never seen a living thing be awake. Every part of him was engaged. His body was different. His posture was different. The softness had not left his face, but something else had arrived behind it, like a second pair of eyes opening in the dark. He moved with a speed and precision that should not have existed in a body without claws or fangs or armor. In 90 seconds, he had the dormitory organized. The oldest cubs were assigned positions at each corner of the room. Keller at the main door, Tavash at the secondary hatch, Ren at the ventilation access. Each of them was given one instruction and one job, and Jonah spoke to them not as children, but as soldiers, and they obeyed because his voice made something very old in their bones. Understand that this was not a request. The youngest cubs and the fusty smallest were moved to the center of the room, the inner core, the most reinforced section of the ship, where the walls were thickest and the blast doors heaviest. Solak helped carry the little ones. His paws were shaking, but his breathing was steady. 4 in, hold, 4 out. Just like Jonah taught him, Jonah sealed every door. He barricaded every access point. He moved through the room like water, finding cracks and filling them, and Ren watched him build a fortress out of a nursery in the time it would take most adults to finish being afraid. The ship rocked again. Closer this time. The sound was different. Not the dull thud of plasma fire against outer hull. This was sharper. A grinding, screeching tier of metal being cut. They were coming in. Ren could hear the fighting in the corridors beyond. Veyari warriors meeting the Crevan boarding parties with fang and claw, and the wet, terrible sounds of close combat in tight spaces. The warriors were fierce. The warriors were brave. But Ren could tell by the way the sounds kept getting closer that the warriors were not. Enough in. Jonah stopped. He was standing near the main blast door. His head was tilted slightly. His eyes were focused on something that was not in the room. He was listening. Ren strained her ears and heard nothing but alarms and distant fighting and the whimpering of frightened cubs, but Jonah heard something else. A faint clicking sound, chitin on metal, coming from the maintenance shaft that ran behind the east wall of the dormitory. A shaft that was not on any standard defensive plan because it was too narrow for an adult Veyari to fit through. But a Crevan drone was not built like a Veyari. A Crevan drone was built to fit into exactly the kinds of places that bigger species forgot about. They had found the back door to the nursery. Jonah turned to Ren. His face was calm. His eyes were steady. But she could see something in them now that she had only glimpsed once before when Keller had challenged him. That still deep thing that lived behind the warmth. Lock this door behind me, he said. Do not open it for anyone who does not say the word sunflower. Do you understand? She stared at him. He had no weapon. He had no armor. He had nothing but his soft human body and his blunt human hands, and he was about to walk into a maintenance corridor to meet creatures that were built for killing Jonah. She said. He looked back at her, and in that look, she saw it. All of it. The thing that every species in the galaxy had missed when they looked at humans and saw. Only the flat teeth and the thin skin and the round wet eyes. Behind all that softness was something that did not calculate odds, did not weigh risk, did not ask whether it could win. It only asked one question, and the question was, are the children behind me? And the answer was yes. And so every other question in the universe stopped mattering. Lock the door, Ren. He stepped out. The door sealed behind him, and then from beyond the metal there came sounds. the rapid clicking of creven legs, a crash of something heavy hitting a wall, a shriek that was not human, a wet heavy impact, another, a sound like something breaking that was made of shell and not bone. More clicking, frantic now and moving away, running. The creven were running, then silence. The cubs stood in the red light and the silence, and they did not breathe. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. 200 children stared at the sealed door and listened to the nothing that came after, and it was the loudest silence Wren had ever heard. The silence was worse than the noise. Wren stood at the sealed blast door with her paw on the lock mechanism and her heart slamming against her ribs, so hard she thought the bones might crack. Behind her, 200 cubs were packed into the reinforced core of the dormitory. The youngest were crying in that thin, high way that Veyari pups cry when the fear is too big for their bodies to hold. The oldest were standing at their posts, exactly where Jonah had placed them, and none of them had moved because he told them not to. Keller stood 3 steps behind Wren. He had pulled a support strut from a damaged bunk frame and was holding it like a weapon. His fur was flat against his body, which among the Veyari meant that the bravery had run out and all that remained was the animal underneath. But he was standing. He had not left his post. Ivish was at the secondary hatch. His ears were moving in small circles, trying to catch any sound from beyond the walls. He heard nothing. The fighting in the distant corridors had faded to something irregular and far away. The alarms had cycled down to a low, steady pulse, like the heartbeat of a dying animal. Minutes passed. Each one felt like it had weight, like time itself had turned into something heavy that pressed down on their skull. Solik was in the center of the room with the youngest cubs. He had gathered 4 of the smallest pups against his body, and he was breathing. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. His paws were trembling, but his chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm that Jonah had planted in him like a seed weeks ago. 2 of the pups had matched their breathing to his. They did not know why it helped. They just knew the small one was calm, and calm was something they desperately needed to be near. Then came the knock. It was slow, deliberate. 3 impacts against the blast door. Not the rapid clicking of creven limbs. Not the coded pattern of a Veyari warrior. Something else than a voice. Wrecked and raw and barely above a whisper. Sunflower Wren hit the lock. The door slid open. The emergency lights were still red, and in that red glow, the corridor beyond looked like something from a nightmare that had decided to stop pretending it was not real. The walls were streaked with fluid. Dark greenish-black fluid that dripped from the ceiling and pooled on the floor and smelled like metal and acid and something organic that had been opened and emptied. There were shapes on the ground. 3 of them. They had been creven once. They were not creven anymore. They were pieces of what creven used to be. Chitin cracked open. Limbs bent in directions that limbs were not designed to go. Compound eyes dark and empty and staring at nothing. The largest one was nearly twice the size of a human. It was face down in a pool of its own fluids, and its back was caved in as if something had hit it again and again and again with a force that should not have been possible from a creature with no claws. And standing in the middle of all of it was Jonah. He was leaning against the wall because his legs were not working properly anymore. One arm hung at his side at an angle that made Wren's stomach turn, because arms were not supposed to bend that way on any species. His hands were destroyed. The skin was torn open across every knuckle, and the flesh beneath was red and wet, and his fingers were swollen into shapes that could not close. There was a deep, ragged wound across his ribs where something sharp had caught him, and from that wound came blood. Human blood. It was red. Not the dark violet of Veyari blood. Not the greenish-black of creven fluid. It was red. Bright, impossible, vivid red. Like the emergency lights had crawled inside him and were leaking out. It ran down his side and soaked into his clothing and dripped onto the floor where it mixed with the alien blood in patterns that looked like something a mad artist would painting his right hand. He held a piece of jagged metal plating. It was not a weapon. It had never been designed as a weapon. It was a piece of the ship's own wall that he had torn free and turned into something that could kill. The edges were dark with Crevan blood, and there was a dent in it that matched the shape of the largest Crevan skull. He looked at the cubs with eyes that were glassy and half-focused. His face was white. Not soft, gentle white. The white of something that had poured too much of itself out and was running on whatever was left. And his first words were not about the pain or the blood or the 3 dead aliens at his feet. "Is anyone hurt?" he said. "Are the little ones okay?" Then his legs folded and he went down. Ren and Keller moved at the same time. They caught him before he hit the floor, and his weight surprised them because he felt heavier than he looked, as if the thing that lived inside him had a mass that his body did not advertise. They dragged him through the door, and Ren sealed it behind them, and the corridor with its dead and its dark was shut away. Vash came running. He had been studying field medicine because he was too nervous for combat training, and his instructors had told him that healers were just as important as warriors. He had not believed them until now. His paws were shaking as he pressed them to the wound on Jonah's ribs, and the red blood welled up between his fingers hot and fast. Jonah looked up at him through eyes that were losing focus, and he did an impossible thing. He started talking to Vash through the treatment. "Pressure here. Not there. Tighter. Good. The binding needs to wrap around, not across. Slower. You are doing fine." He was teaching a child how to save his life. While his life was leaving him, Solek appeared. He had left the youngest cubs with the other older pups and crossed the room with steps that were small but steady. He knelt beside Jonah and picked up a cloth and pressed it to the gash on the human's ribs. His small paws were instantly soaked in red. That bright, vivid red that looked like it belonged to a different universe than the violet that ran through Veyari veins. Jonah looked down at him, and through the pain and the fading and the white of blood loss, he smiled. That same smile, the one the cubs had mistaken for weakness on the first day. "Told you," he whispered. "Small things have power." The battle ended in pieces. Commander Shale's warriors drove the remaining Crevan back to their boarding craft. The Allied fleet arrived, and the 3 corvettes broke formation and ran. The Gentle Dawn survived with scars that would take months to repair, but it survived. When Shale finally reached the creche, she came through the blast door with 4 armed warriors at her back, and she was ready for anything except what she found. She found 200 cubs arranged in a defensive formation, so clean and so precise that it looked like a veteran unit had set it up. She found a triage station built from bedding and supply kits. She found older cubs tending to younger cubs with a calm that should not have existed in children who had just survived their first battle, and she found the corridor. She stood in it and looked at the 3 dead Crevan and the blood on the walls and the bent piece of metal plating on the floor. She looked at the dents and the breaks and the evidence of what had happened in this narrow space. Her second stood beside her, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Then she said, "Pull his file again." The real one. The unredacted version. The file scrolled across the screen in Commander Shale's quarters later that night. Ren was not there to see it. No cub was. But the story would reach them eventually, the way all important stories reach the young. Through whispers and fragments and the weight of what adults do not say. Shale second watched her read. He saw her face change. He saw something move across it that he had never seen on his commander before. It might have been awe. It might have been fear. It was probably both. He was never just a caretaker, she said. Her voice was quiet. No, her second replied. Before this, he was something else entirely. Shale closed the file. She looked at the wall. She thought about the soft, smiling creature who had sat with the runt cub at meals and taught children breathing exercises and declined every challenge. With a gentle no thank you, and then she thought about the corridor, and she understood that these were not two different things. They were the same thing, the same exact thing. And that was what made humans the most terrifying species she had ever encountered. 3 days after the attack, the gentle dawn limped through space like a wounded animal dragging itself towards shelter. The hull was scarred with plasma burns and patched with emergency sealant that looked like gray scabs on silver skin. Half the portside lighting was dead. The air recyclers hummed in a tone that was slightly wrong. The ship would survive, but it would carry the memory of what happened in its metal for as long as it flew. The cubs were different. Ren could see it in the way they moved. The careless, rowdy energy that had filled the creche halls was gone, replaced by something quieter and more watchful. They moved in tighter groups now. They flinched at loud sounds. 2 of the youngest pups had stopped speaking entirely and simply clung to whoever was nearest with wide eyes that had seen too much too early. But underneath the fear, there was something else. Something new. The cubs had survived. Not because the warriors had saved them. The warriors had fought bravely, and many of them had bled, and some of them had died. But in the moment when the Creven had found the back door to the nursery and the warriors were too far away, and the only thing between 200 children and the dark was one soft-skinned human with no claws and no fangs and no weapon. In that moment, it had been enough. Jonah's lessons lived in him now. The formations he had taught them in 90 seconds of controlled chaos had held. The triage station Devash built had treated 7 cubs with minor injuries before any adult medic arrived. The breathing technique Salak had used to keep the youngest pups calm had spread through the group until half the dormitory was breathing in rhythm, like a single living thing. The cubs did not understand yet what they had learned, but their bodies knew. Their bones knew. The coward thinking that Keller had laughed at was the thing that kept them. Alivern went to see Jonah on the 3rd day. The medbay was quiet and smelled like antiseptic and the particular chemical tang of regeneration gel. Jonah was lying on a bed that was too large for him because Veyari were bigger than humans and the ship had been built for Veyari bodies. He looked small in it. His right arm was encased in a regeneration sleeve that hummed softly as it rebuilt the bones and tendons that had been broken. Bandages covered the wound on his ribs and smaller cuts on his face and neck and hands. His skin was still too pale. His eyes were closed. Ren sat in the chair beside his bed. The chair was too tall for comfortable sitting, so she tucked her legs beneath her the way she did when she was a small pup, listening to stories from the elders. Jonah opened his eyes. They were the same, soft and round and warm. The thing that had looked out from behind them in the corridor was gone. Or not gone. Sleeping. Curled up somewhere inside him where it waited. She did not say hello. She did not ask how he was feeling. She asked the only question that mattered. What are you? He looked at her for a long time. The machine on his arm hummed. The ship creaked around them with the sounds of a vessel trying to hold itself together. Then he told her not everything. She was a child, and some things were not for children. But enough, he had been a soldier. A specific kind of soldier in a specific kind of war. Not the kind the Veyari sang songs about. Not the kind where 2 armies met on an open field, and the brave and the strong were rewarded. The kind where the enemy came at night to places where families slept. Where the targets were not warriors, but the small and the helpless and the ones who had never held a weapon. He had been on a colony world. He had been tasked with protecting a settlement. He had failed. Not because he was weak or cowardly or slow. Because there were too many of them and not enough of him, and the math of war does not care about courage. He did not tell her what he saw in that settlement. He did not need to. She could see it in the geography of his face. in the way his eyes went somewhere else for a moment. Somewhere that the medbay lights could not reach. What grew in the place where the breaking happened was not rage. It was not a thirst for revenge. It was something quieter and more permanent. A decision, made once and never revisited. A line drawn in the dirt of his soul that said this far and no further, and not while I am still breathing. He left the military after that. He could not go back to normal life, because normal life required a kind of forgetting that his mind refused to do. So he went looking for the places where someone like him was needed. Creche ships, refugee transports, evacuation convoys. The posts that nobody wanted because they were boring and thankless and far from glory. The places where someone quiet and patient and watchful could stand between small lives and the dark and not need anyone to see him doing. I am not a warrior, he told Ren. Warriors fight because it is who they are. I fight because of what I am. Standing in front of Ren sat with this. She turned it over in her mind, the way she would turn over a stone from an alien world. Something familiar in its weight, but strange in its color. Among the Veyari, a protector earned the title through challenge and dominance and the display of power. You proved you were strong enough to shield others by being stronger than the things that threatened them. Jonah was not stronger than the Creven. He was not faster. He was not tougher. He had won in that corridor, not because his body was superior, but because something inside him simply did not contain the option of stopping. The Creven could hurt him and break him and cut him open, and he would keep going because the alternative was that something behind him would be harmed, and that alternative did not exist in his universe. He was not a wall because he was made of stone. He was a wall because he refused to be a door. Jonah was released from the medbay that evening. He walked into the creche commons slowly with his arms still bound and his steps careful and uneven. He looked diminished again, soft, human, a creature that any predator in the galaxy would look at and see as something easy. The cubs saw him. The room went silent. Kayla stood up. The bold one, the proud one, the one who had called Jonah a prey animal and mocked his flat teeth and challenged him to fight. He crossed the room and stopped in front of the human, and for a moment the two of them just looked at each other. The tall silver wolf cub and the small battered man. Then Keller bared his throat. He tilted his head back and exposed the soft underside of his neck where the fur was thinnest and the pulse beat closest to the surface. It was the deepest gesture in Veyari culture. It was not submission. It was trust. It was the act of showing your most vulnerable place to another being and saying, I believe you will protect this. It was given only to the highest pack leaders, only to the ones who had earned it in blood. One by one, every cub in the room did the same. 200 silver throats bared under the lights. 200 children telling the human what the Veyari had 1,000 words for, but what Jonah had proven with a piece of scrap metal and his bare hands in a dark corridor. Solek was last. He came forward from the back of the room, where old habits still placed him, even though nobody pushed him there anymore. He walked up to Jonah with his small, steady steps, and he did not bare his throat. Instead, he reached up and wrapped his arms around Jonah's waist and pressed his face into the human's chest and held on. It was not a Veyari gesture. It was a human one. Something Solek must have learned from watching, from sitting beside Jonah at meals, from the quiet way the human had taught him that small things have power. Jonah's composure broke. The steadiness that had held through blood and violence and the screaming dark of a corridor full of death. The calm that had talked a child through saving his life while his own was draining away. The quiet, unshakable thing that had kept 200 cubs alive when every odds said they should not be. It all cracked at once like ice on a river when the spring finally comes. He put his good hand on Solek's head and he closed his eyes. And the cubs saw something that none of them had ever seen before, a human crying not from pain, not from grief, Not from the memory of the settlement he could not save, or the corridor he almost did not survive. He cried the way a creature cries when it has been holding something so tightly, and for so long that the muscles have forgotten how to open. He cried because the children were alive. All of them. Every single one, and Ren watched from across the room with tears making silver tracks down her own furred cheeks, and she understood. At last what the galaxy had gotten wrong. About humans they had looked at the soft skin and the blunt teeth, and the round wet eyes, and they had seen prey. They had measured the humans against their warriors, and found them small and slow and fragile. They had not understood humans did not fight like wolves. They did not fight like hunters or predators, or any of the 1,000 species that killed, because killing was in their blood. Humans fought like something the galaxy had no name for. They fought like the last door at the end of a dark hallway. The one that would not open, not because it was made of stronger metal, but because something on the other side had decided, quietly and without ceremony and without anyone asking, that nothing gets through, and the blood on the corridor floor was simply what happened when something was foolish enough to try.